Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a place where the trees themselves seem to remember every scream. You're standing in Blackthorn Valley, Virginia, October of 1979. The air is sharp, smelling of wood smoke and rain-soaked leaves, but underneath it lingers something sweeter, metallic blood. At 3:12 a.m., the silence of the valley is broken. A child's voice cuts through the forest, a single shriek that carries farther than it should, bouncing against the ridgelines before it vanishes into nothing. You freeze. The dogs down in the hollow are the first to react, their howls spiraling upward, desperate, like they've sensed a predator that doesn't belong to this world. For a few endless minutes, the cries go on, thinner and thinner, until they collapse into silence. And that silence doesn't feel natural. It feels placed, heavy, suffocating. You walk forward and find the ashes of a campfire still glowing faintly, a child's shoe lying abandoned beside the embers. The laces are snapped, torn, like they were pulled apart in haste. There's no sign of the boy who wore them. Instead, you notice the ground, disturbed drag marks, small handprints pressed deep into the damp earth, as though someone struggled, clawed, and was pulled backward into the trees. In the dark, something else catches your eye. A thin ribbon of smoke rises from deeper in the forest. Not campfire smoke, but darker, acrid, carrying a sickly sweet odor. It twists into the sky like a signal no one sane would ever send. You realize you aren't alone here. The valley itself feels like it's watching, holding its breath, waiting to see if you'll follow the path of blood into the trees. Before you dive deeper into this chilling truth, consider hitting like and subscribing, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with the time and place you're watching, so I know you're still out there. And we'll dive into tonight's journey together. Yet you step back from the edge of that abandoned campsite, and the cold begins to settle into your bones. To understand what happened in Blackthorn Valley that night in 1979, you have to go back more than 100 years to the people who first claimed this land and shaped it into something no outsider ever truly survived. The Kettering family arrived in the valley around 1886. Descendants of Scotch-Irish settlers who drifted south through the mountains. They built no grand homes, only scattered cabins that leaned into the hillsides like broken teeth. Over time, their land became a patchwork of trailers, shacks, and smokehouses stitched together with rusted tin and weather-beaten lumber. Outsiders who strayed in saw poverty. But if you lived here, you knew it was something more, an entire clan that thrived by keeping others out. You learned that isolation was their first weapon. The county road was paved only as far as the church. Beyond that, it turned to gravel, then to mud. Mail came once a week. Electricity didn't arrive until the mid-1960s, and even then, most of the Ketterings refused it, choosing to light their homes with kerosene lanterns that flickered like watchful eyes. They taught their children to fear townsfolk, to never speak to strangers, to keep family secrets locked behind their teeth. Whispers followed the Ketterings everywhere. In the 1930s, a traveling preacher vanished after delivering a sermon in the hollow. In the 1950s, a pair of surveyors disappeared while mapping property lines. Locals explained it away: accidents, falls, wild animals. The mountains ate people sometimes. That was just life. But families in the nearest town of Merrow Ridge learned to warn their children. Don't wander near Blackthorn. Don't follow voices in the trees. You see the shape of the Kettering's traditions, strange songs sung to babies in a dialect no one else understood. Songs that carried lilting harmonies, beautiful yet unsettling. Boys were raised to hunt not just game, but anything that crossed the tree line. Girls were taught how to preserve meat in salt barrels, how to stretch skin into leather. To them, it wasn't strange. It was inheritance. Patriarch Silas Kettering, who ruled the Hollow from the 1940s until his death in 1972, set the tone. He filed his teeth sharp as proof of strength and demanded his sons do the same. He told stories by lantern light about ancestors in the old country who had survived famine by taking meat wherever it could be found. Hunger makes law, he'd rasp, and his grandchildren would echo it back like a prayer. By the 1970s, Ezekiel Silas's eldest son had become the new head of the clan. He was broader, harder, with a stare that could hollow you out. He fathered children with cousins, nieces, anyone within reach, until the bloodlines twisted together so tightly that their family tree resembled a thorn bush more than an oak. Many children bore the same sharp cheekbones, the same slanted eyes. And yet, each one carried the family's mark: obedience, silence, hunger. Neighbors sometimes caught sight of the Kettering children at the edge of town, trading pelts for flour or mason jars of homemade liquor for batteries. Their eyes never lifted from the floor. Their bodies looked stunted, thin, as though something in their bones never grew right. Rumor said they feared the daylight, that they preferred to move in the hours just before dawn. Their voices carrying soft songs that didn't sound like any hymns known in the churches of Merrow Ridge. Social workers tried, once. A young woman named Ellen Morris drove into the valley in 1976, attempting to enroll the children in school. Her report described severe developmental delays. Multiple children who seemed more like siblings than cousins, and a silence that was unnatural. They wouldn't speak when she asked their names, but when she left, she swore she heard them chanting together behind her back. Ellen quit her job within months. The report was buried by her supervisor. Mountain families had their ways, he reasoned, and the Ketterings weren't hurting anyone, at least. Not that anyone could prove, but animals knew better. Hunters noticed deer trails avoided the hollow. Dogs dragged their owners in the opposite direction, whining, tails tucked. And in the creek that cut through the Kettering compound, water ran dark, as if stained by something the earth itself couldn't filter out. You realize that by the time Deputy Paul Mercer first stepped onto Kettering land in 1979, the family had already perfected a system. For generations, they had been shaping their children, teaching them patience, silence, and cruelty. They didn't need books or schools. The only lessons were survival and hunger. And you can almost see the flicker of firelight through a trailer's torn curtains. Shadows of children gathered around an elder, listening as if to scripture. You hear the whisper passed from lip to lip, a single phrase that binds them tighter than blood. The world feeds us if we're willing to take. What chance did anyone have, walking into their hollow after dark? The night air in Blackthorn Valley always carried weight, as though the hills themselves were pressing in. You can imagine Deputy Paul Mercer tightening his jacket against the chill as he guided his patrol car along the winding gravel road on October 17th, 1979. He wasn't a rookie. 6 years in the county had taught him how to handle moonshiners, drunks, and hunters who wandered too far. But the report that night was different. A child missing from a campsite near the valley. No tracks, no sounds, except for a scream swallowed by the dark. Mercer parked just past the wooden bridge at the creek's bend. Headlights cutting through the mist. The forest seemed too still. Normally, the night sang with crickets and owls, but here, silence had taken their place. He stepped out, boots crunching against the damp gravel, flashlight in one hand, the other resting near his holstered revolver. You picture the scene, a circle of stone marking where a fire had burned low, smoke still curling faintly upward. Beside it, a single canvas tent stood half collapsed, zipper torn, and on the ground, Mercer saw the detail that made his stomach twist: a purple bicycle, its streamers tangled in the mud, one wheel still spinning as if someone had let go only moments before. He recognized it from the missing person flyer pinned on the station board earlier that week. The boy's name was Joshua Ray, 6 years old, last seen chasing fireflies while his parents cooked supper. Mercer crouched low, shining his light over the ground. Small prints pressed into the dirt, sharp where toes dug in. Then the prints blurred, sliding backward as if the child had been dragged. He followed the marks toward the tree line, where they simply stopped, swallowed by the undergrowth. He raised his radio, voice steady. Unit 7, on scene. Confirm evidence of abduction. Possible direction east toward Blackthorn property, requesting backup. Static crackled, then faded. No reply. He adjusted the dial, tried again. Nothing. That's when he heard it faint. High-pitched singing drifting from deeper in the woods. At first it sounded like a lullaby, gentle, almost sweet. But the harmony was wrong, too many voices layered, overlapping in a way that prickled his skin. They weren't singing to him, but the sound still pulled at him, beckoning. He should have waited for backup. He should have turned around. Instead, he drew his weapon and stepped into the trees. The deeper he went, the stronger the smell became, a mixture of wood smoke and iron. His flashlight beam cut across makeshift markers nailed into trunks, animal skulls, bits of cloth, even a rusted horseshoe twisted into a spiral, a warning, or maybe a welcome sign. Mercer pressed forward. The singing stopped all at once. The forest held its breath. Then, movement. 3 figures emerged from behind a rusted pickup parked near a sagging double-wide trailer. Children, their ages impossible to guess, thin, pallid, clothes ragged and filthy. One girl, hair matted into ropes, stood slightly ahead of the others. Her eyes caught the light, reflecting it back with an almost animal glow. "You ain't supposed to be here after dark," she said, voice flat but heavy with authority. Mercer identified himself, badge glinting. weapon lowered, but ready. He explained about the missing boy. The children stared. The girl's lips twitched into something that might have been a smile or a warning. She tilted her head toward the trailer. Granddaddy knows. Mercer's light swept across the compound. More shadows moved inside the trailer. Shapes at the windows, watching. The smell of cooking meat drifted out through torn curtains, rich and heavy. His stomach clenched. He approached slowly, boots sinking into mud. The porch boards groaned under his weight. He knocked once, firm. The sounds inside stopped immediately. No clinking dishes, no voices, only silence. The door creaked open. Ezekiel Kettering stood there. Taller than Mercer remembered from old mugshots. Shoulders stooped, but powerful. His face was lined, but his teeth gleamed sharp, filed to points. His eyes carried no fear, only calculation. Evening. Deputy, he drawled. Bit late for social calls. Mercer kept his gun low, his gaze scanning past Ezekiel into the trailer. A long table stretched across the room, lit by lanterns, plates set, steam rising from serving bowls. At least a dozen family members sat around it, unmoving. Forks suspended halfway to their mouths. Their eyes tracked him, unblinking. The meat on the table looked wrong. Chunks too large, too red. The proportions didn't match venison or hog. Just checking on reports of gunfire. Mercer said carefully, "Need to make sure everyone's safe." Ezekiel's grin widened. "Safe as houses. Just had ourselves a hunt. These mountains are full of things that come out after dark." Behind him, one of the children giggled, a high, sharp sound that sliced through the silence. Mercer's instincts screamed. He stepped back toward the porch rail. That's when his light caught something half buried near the trailer's corner. A child's shoe, small, mud-caked. Its laces torn. The missing boy's. Mercer raised his weapon fully now. Voice firm. "Where is he?" The family members around the table leaned forward, their forks clattering down, every eye fixed on him. Pupils dilating like predators scenting prey. Ezekiel stepped aside, gesturing toward the table with mock courtesy. "Why don't you come in? Deputy supper's just startin'." Mercer's finger tightened on the trigger. He should have fired then. He should have run. But hesitation cost him. From the shadows, movement, dozens of children spilling from the trailers, circling him with eerie synchronization. Their teeth flashed sharp. Their nails glinted like claws. They didn't lunge, not yet. They were waiting, savoring the moment, the way hunters let their prey sweat before the kill. Mercer's radio crackled faintly, then went dead. The circle tightened. The only way out was through the forest, deeper into the valley, where the Ketterings had prepared for this moment across generations. And you realize this is how the first blood was drawn. Not with a scream in the night, but with silence, patience, and a family who had perfected the art of hunting human beings. You can still hear the echo of that first confrontation. Deputy Mercer standing on the porch with his weapon drawn, surrounded by eyes that gleamed too bright in the dark. But that night was only the beginning. What followed over the next 3 years would spread terror through every ridge and holler that touched Blackthorn Valley. At first, The disappearances seemed scattered. A boy vanished from a fishing trip with his grandfather near Ash Creek in the summer of 1980. The old man swore he'd only turned his back for a minute. When he spun around, the fishing rod still leaned against the bank. The tackle box open, but the boy himself was gone a week later. Searchers found scraps of his shirt wedged into a briar patch 2 miles deeper in the woods, too far for a child to have gone alone. Then, a teenage girl named Marlene Price never made it home from her waitressing shift at the diner off Highway 23. Her car was found idling at the roadside, purse still on the passenger seat, driver's door ajar. Tire tracks suggested another vehicle had pulled up alongside hers. The sheriff wrote it off as a runaway, but her mother insisted Marlene would never abandon her baby brother. No one ever saw her again. You start noticing the patterns, each victim small enough to be overpowered quickly, each one isolated, caught in a sliver of time when no one was watching. The families left behind clutched at explanations, accidents, kidnappings, hitchhikers, but none of the stories fit, and every time, whispers trickled back to the same place, Blackthorn Valley. Hunters began avoiding the area. They spoke of deer carcasses left half-eaten, bones cracked in ways animals didn't do. One man claimed he saw children moving together at dusk, slipping through the trees with the silence of shadows. He didn't report it officially, just warned others to stay clear. But the boldness of the Ketterings grew. By late 1980, disappearances stretched farther. A young camper named David Chen was taken from Pine Hollow Park, nearly 30 miles from the valley. His father described hearing a lullaby in the night, soft voices carrying through the campground. When he rose to check, his son's sleeping bag was empty, zipper undone, as if by careful hands. Investigators searched the park for weeks, but no remains surfaced. Back in Merrill Ridge, townsfolk whispered louder now. Some claimed to hear children singing near their barns after dark, voices weaving through the wind like threads of an old hymn. Others found crude drawings scratched into tree trunks, stick figures with wide mouths, rows of teeth, and circles around their eyes. Still, the sheriff's department shrugged. Wolves, they said, runaways, accidents. Their reluctance wasn't incompetence alone, it was fear. No deputy wanted to set foot in the Ketterings Hollow after Mercer. He'd returned shaken, unwilling to speak of what he'd seen. His official report mentioned suspected child neglect and possible involvement in missing persons cases, but it ended there. He knew the truth, but couldn't drag it into daylight without proof. Meanwhile, the Ketterings' rituals escalated. Witnesses described torchlight seen flickering between the trees, strange smoke rising from the valley on moonless nights, carrying odors too heavy to be venison, and the songs, always the songs. Hunters who lingered too long swore they heard harmonies that lulled them, pulling them toward the valley's edge. One man followed the sound until he stumbled into a clearing littered with bones, gnawed clean, piled like cordwood. He fled without looking back. By 1981, the disappearances could no longer be ignored. 5 children, 3 teenagers, and 2 adults had gone missing within a 40-mile radius. Search parties scoured caves, rivers, and abandoned mines. But nothing was ever found intact. Only fragments of shoe, a ribbon, a cracked jawbone. Each discovery deepened the sense that something monstrous, deliberate, was claiming the valley for itself. And then came the summer solstice of 1981, when 3 campers, 2 boys and a girl, vanished from a group hike. Their tents were found intact, food untouched, but the logs of the campfire were arranged into a perfect spiral, ashes cool, as though someone had sat watching for hours before snuffing it out. The spiral became a signature, appearing at other sites, burned into the dirt, carved into tree trunks, etched on abandoned barns. You realize this wasn't chaos, it was ritual. Each disappearance timed with a season, each mark deliberate. One surviving witness, a boy of 15 named Caleb, stumbled into town barefoot, trembling. He claimed he'd been lured by a girl with pale hair who promised to show him fireflies. She led him deeper into the forest, humming softly. Then, from the shadows, others emerged, children with sharpened teeth, eyes gleaming. He ran before they could encircle him. When pressed, he insisted the girl's voice didn't sound human. It rose and fell in tones that made his skin crawl, tones he still heard in his dreams. The sheriff dismissed him as hysterical, but townsfolk whispered Kettering, always Kettering. By late 1981, the valley had become a place no outsider dared to enter. Hunters crossed themselves when they passed its borders. Travelers avoided its roads, and yet, still, the hunger spread outward. The family was no longer content with wanderers who stumbled too close. They reached beyond the ridges, pulling children from campgrounds, workers from highways, girls from their cars, and every time, the evidence whispered the same story: drag marks in the dirt, spirals of ash, laughter carried on the wind. It wasn't just that no one could stop them, it was that no one truly tried. Authorities looked away, neighbors stayed silent, and the family's power grew in the shadows. The Ketterings had perfected their feast. And you know now, with every bone and every missing child, that this wasn't random violence. It was escalation. A hunger handed down through generations, growing bolder with every scream swallowed by the valley. The question wasn't who would be next. It was how long until the whole region became their table. You follow the trail of fear into 1982, when the missing person flyers began covering bulletin boards across 3 counties. Faces of children, teenagers, and the occasional hiker stared back from faded photocopies, eyes frozen in hope while families pleaded for answers. Yet each search ended the same way: empty hands, false leads, silence. The investigation into Blackthorn Valley was a story of hesitation, incompetence, and willful blindness, a failure that allowed the Ketterings' rituals to thrive. At first, the sheriff's office treated every disappearance as an isolated incident. Deputy reports were sparse: possible runaway, camping accident, fell in the river. They ticked boxes and closed files, unwilling to draw the connections that seemed obvious to anyone watching. Maybe it was fear of the valley. Maybe it was loyalty to Ezekiel Kettering, who'd once supplied half the county with moonshine. Or maybe it was simpler. Nobody wanted to believe families could do what the Ketterings were doing. But the clues were there, scattered like breadcrumbs. A fisherman found a child's toy car wedged between rocks at the creek, its paint stripped by water, but still recognizable as one sold in town. A hunter brought in bone fragments he'd found near a thicket, fragments later identified as human. Though the sheriff delayed sending them to the state lab for months, each time, the evidence surfaced briefly, then disappeared into file cabinets. You picture the frustration of parents. Mrs. Price, whose daughter Marlene had vanished from the roadside, stormed into the sheriff's office demanding answers. She slammed her daughter's driver's license on the counter, voice breaking as she accused them of cowardice. The deputies shuffled, muttered about limited resources, then escorted her out. Her rage echoed down the hallway like a curse. Meanwhile, strange stories began circulating from those who had brushed against the Kettering's world and survived. One man, a delivery driver, claimed he saw children with sharpened teeth watching him from the edge of the valley road as he passed at dusk. Another reported hearing voices calling his name from the woods, though no one he knew lived there. A teenage couple parked near the ridge swore they saw torchlight moving in coordinated lines, too precise to be drunken wanderings. Investigators from the state were eventually called in, but they too stumbled. They conducted interviews, mapped the disappearances, and noticed how they radiated outward from Blackthorn like ripples in water, but without bodies. Their case was fragile, and when they pressed locals for testimony, they were met with silence. Families who lived near the valley avoided eye contact, muttered that the mountains had their ways, and begged not to be dragged into trouble. Fear, it seemed, had rooted deeper than justice. One of the most chilling pieces of evidence surfaced in September 1982. A hiker stumbled upon an underground entrance, just a narrow shaft in the earth, hidden beneath branches. Inside, he found crude wooden doors leading to a tunnel. The air stank of rot, heavy with damp earth and smoke. He fled before going deeper, but not before he saw the walls scratched with names and dates. He reported it to police. The site was dismissed as old mining activity. No follow-up. You realize now that the system failed at every turn. Reports buried, evidence misfiled, witnesses dismissed, and in that void, the Ketterings grew stronger. But not all failures came from ignorance. Some were laced with something darker. Deputy Mercer, the only one who'd truly seen inside the compound, tried to push his department to act. He filed request after request for warrants, citing suspicion of organized criminal activity. His reports were quietly shelved. Other deputies whispered that Mercer was spooked, that the valley had gotten into his head. His career began to unravel, first suspension, then reassignment. The Ketterings had friends in places where silence mattered most, and yet, the investigation couldn't be smothered forever. Journalists caught wind. A young reporter from Lexington named Clara Whitfield began piecing together the cases. She wrote about the spiral fire pits, the repeated sightings of children with identical features, the chilling overlap between missing person maps and Kettering territory. Her articles drew attention, but also ridicule. Urban legend. The papers scoffed. Appalachian folklore. Still, her persistence gnawed at the edges of the silence. And then came the moment that tipped the scales. A boy named Caleb, the same teenager who had escaped the valley months earlier, was interviewed by state police. He told them about the girl with pale hair, the one who lured him toward the trees. He described how her voice shifted into something not quite human, how other children emerged with sharpened teeth and nails. He told them about their games, the way they circled him, giggling like predators. His testimony was dismissed as hallucination at first, but when he was shown a lineup of local families, he pointed to the Ketterings without hesitation. It was the first time someone outside had named them directly. Still, bureaucracy dragged its feet. Search warrants were filed, denied, rewritten, and delayed. Meanwhile, more children vanished. 2 sisters from a church picnic, a boy from a roadside rest area. The valley seemed to reach farther each month, pulling victims like moths into its darkness. As 1982 drew to a close, the evidence piled higher tunnels, sharpened teeth, spirals of ash, witnesses scarred by what they'd seen. But each time the investigators thought they had a breakthrough, it dissolved in paperwork and fear. You realize the horror wasn't just the family hidden in the valley. It was the silence that wrapped around them, the complicity of neighbors, the cowardice of law enforcement, and in that silence, the songs of the Kettering children carried farther. They sang from the tree line at dusk, their harmonies weaving into the night air like threads of a net. Anyone who lingered too long heard it. Some followed. Few returned. The investigation should have stopped them. Instead, it fed the legend, allowing the family to refine their methods, sharpen their rituals, and prepare for the moment when the truth would finally come crashing down. But by then, it would already be too late. You think by now, the story should resolve, the law stepping in, order restored. But the truth waited in the shadows. And when it finally showed itself, it was worse than anything the files or rumors could prepare you for. The investigation had dragged long enough. When federal agents at last moved to search Blackthorn Valley in late autumn of 1982, what they uncovered reshaped every assumption about the Ketterings. It began with a raid that came just before dawn. A dozen cruisers and 2 unmarked federal vans crawling up the mud road. Agents expected resistance, maybe gunfire. Instead, they were met with eerie quiet. The trailers stood still, smoke rising from chimneys, but no voices, no movement. Doors hung open as though abandoned minutes earlier. Inside the main double-wide, agents found a feast laid out on a long table. Plates arranged neatly, steam still rising from serving bowls. But there were no people, only silence and the smell of meat that was wrong, sweet and metallic. On the walls hung crude drawings, stick figures circled by hunters, children with sharp teeth, spirals burned into wood. It looked less like art and more like record-keeping. Then the tunnels revealed themselves, hidden beneath trapdoors. They wound deep into the valley's soil, reinforced with scavenged timber and rusted sheet metal. Agents crept inside with flashlights, finding chambers lined with shelves of jars. Some held cloudy liquid and preserved organs. Others contained bones wrapped in cloth, labeled with dates and names scratched into the wood. The chilling truth was impossible to deny. This was not random violence, not desperate hunger. It was a system, organized and perfected across decades. The Ketterings had turned predation into ritual. In one chamber, agents found rows of children's clothing, folded by size, tiny shoes, ribbons, shirts neatly stacked as though waiting for an owner. Scrawled into the walls were dozens of names: Joshua Ray, Marlene Price, David Chen, and many more, each with a date, each a reminder that the missing hadn't simply vanished. They had been cataloged, consumed. Some agents refused to continue. One broke down vomiting in the tunnel. The rest pushed deeper, only to hear faint sounds ahead, whispers, giggles, the shuffle of small feet. They weren't alone. The children emerged from the shadows like a pack, thin, feral, their eyes glowing in the beams of flashlights. Some hissed, others smiled. Their teeth were filed sharp, their nails grown long. And yet, the most terrifying thing was not their appearance, but their silence. They moved with precision, circling the agents with the patience of hunters. These were no ordinary children. They were the Ketterings' legacy, shaped from birth to hunt and obey. One girl stepped forward, pale hair falling in ropes. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm. "You don't belong here." It was the same girl Caleb had described months earlier. Her presence confirmed his testimony wasn't madness. She had been raised as bait, a lure to draw outsiders deeper until escape was impossible. The agents withdrew, using the tunnel's narrow walls as cover. Above ground, the rest of the compound was searched, but the adult Ketterings were gone. They had scattered through the mountains before the raid, warned by some unseen signal. Only the children remained, half feral, bound by loyalty to elders who had vanished into the wilderness. Interrogations followed. The youngest children barely spoke, only repeated fragments of songs. The older ones were worse. They laughed when asked about the missing, reciting phrases like catechism, "Hunger makes law," "The world feeds us if we're willing to take." And then came Ezekiel's journal, found hidden in a crawl space. His handwriting was jagged, erratic, but his words revealed the truth. The family's practices weren't desperation from poverty. They were tradition, passed from Silas to Ezekiel and taught to every child. The entries documented hunts like trophies' names, weights, meat quality, notes on how certain victims screamed longer, how others fed the children best. One entry chilled investigators most. "Teach them young. Teach them to sing. The song draws them in like moths to flame." It was clear now, the lullabies weren't accidents. They were weapons, refined across generations, designed to lure prey. And the voices that parents heard in the night were not hallucinations. They were rehearsed, perfected. What shocked the investigators most was the scope. Notes in Ezekiel's journal mentioned other families, cousins in Tennessee, kin in West Virginia, friends down south. The Ketterings were not alone. They were part of a network, a web of clans that had preserved the same hunger through blood and secrecy. Blackthorn was only one hollow among many. The truth, once revealed, shattered any illusion that the valley's horror could be contained. This was no isolated nightmare. It was a tradition buried deep in the Appalachian soil, older than the law, older than the towns around it. And you realize, standing in the valley as dawn breaks, that the silence was never absence. It was the sound of generations waiting, teaching, and feeding. The Ketterings hadn't simply disappeared with the raid. They had spread, roots stretching into other hollows, other ridges. The horror was not that the family existed. The horror was that they had perfected their way of life and passed it on. The raid ended with fire. Federal agents poured accelerant through the tunnels and trailers, lighting the compound until flames swallowed every board and rafter. The sky above Blackthorn Valley glowed red, smoke coiling into the mountains like a signal to anyone still watching. People in Marrow Ridge claimed they could smell the burning miles away, a mix of kerosene, wood, and something far darker. The official record marked the Kettering case as contained. Dozens of children were taken into custody, scattered across foster homes, psychiatric wards, and state facilities. Some wept and clung to each other, refusing to eat unless food was salted and cured the way they'd learned in the hollow. Others lashed out violently, biting, clawing, their sharp teeth leaving scars that would never fade. Investigators logged the evidence: clothing, journals, jars, bones. Hundreds of names etched into wood and stone, each one tied to a family somewhere who would never see closure. But for every box of proof, there were more questions. How many others were still out there at how many valleys? How many families? How many songs carried through the night belonged to kin who had already fled Ezekiel, and the older Ketterings were never captured? Rumors swirled of sightings, an old man with sharpened teeth trading pelts in Tennessee, a pale-haired girl leading strangers into the woods in West Virginia. Each report was unconfirmed, dismissed as local superstition. But the agents knew better. You know better. The valley itself never healed. Hunters avoided it, though some swore they saw smoke rising from the burned-out ground years later. Like the earth itself refused to forget. Campers who strayed too close claimed they heard faint singing in the distance, harmonies twisting through the trees long after the last Kettering child had been taken away. Deputy Mercer retired early, haunted by the bicycle he'd seen half buried in mud. He moved south, drew his curtains, and never set foot in the mountains again. But he couldn't escape the sound of voices that sometimes reached him in his dreams. Children's lullabies carrying across decades, reminding him of the night he first knocked on Ezekiel's door. And now, you're left with the same question investigators never answered: if the Ketterings were only one branch of a network, how many others are still hunting under the cover of isolation? What if you're camping one night, your fire dying low, and you hear soft singing in the trees, sweet, wrong, pulling you closer? Would you recognize the sound for what it is before it's too late? Before you dive into your next story, remember, horrors like this don't always stay buried in history. They echo, waiting for someone else to hear them. If this story kept you awake tonight, consider hitting like and subscribing so you don't miss the next descent into the shadows. And drop a comment below. Tell me, could you sleep in a place where children's voices call from the dark?